The radio crackled like fire-eating paper. 43 men held their breath. In the war room of Imperial General Headquarters, the most powerful military leaders in Japan stood frozen, their boots pressed hard against the floor as if the earth itself might betray them. The clock on the wall showed noon. August 15, 1945. The moment that would end an empire, General Korechika Anami, the war minister, stood at the front. His uniform was perfect. Every button polished. Every medal in place. He had fought in Manchuria. He had crushed rebellions in China. He had sent 3 million soldiers across Asia and the Pacific. Now he waited for a voice he had never heard speak to common people, the voice of a living god. The static cleared. Emperor Hirohito began to speak. The language was ancient. Formal court Japanese that most men struggled to understand. But certain words cut through like blades. Endure the unendurable. Bear the unbearable. And then, the word that stopped hearts, surrender. Anami did not move. Behind him, he heard the sharp intake of breath from younger officers. He heard the soft sound of a man weeping. He heard knuckles cracking as fists tightened around sword handles. The broadcast continued, but the meaning was already clear. Japan had lost. The divine wind had failed. The 100 million souls who were supposed to fight to the death on the beaches would lay down their weapons instead. The emperor's voice faded. The radio returned to static. For 3 seconds, no one moved, then Colonel Masataka Ida screamed. This is a lie. The young staff officer's face twisted with rage. The Americans have captured His Majesty. This is propaganda. We must rescue the emperor. Anami raised his hand. The gesture was small, but the room fell silent instantly. Every officer knew what that hand had done. It had signed orders that sent divisions into battle. It had approved kamikaze missions that killed 4,000 pilots. It had held the power of life and death over millions. The emperor has spoken, Anami said. His voice was quiet. Steady. Dead. General Yoshijiro Yumizu, the army chief of staff, stepped forward. He was a pragmatist. He had seen the intelligence reports. He knew that the Americans had bombs that could destroy entire cities in a single flash. Hiroshima was gone. Nagasaki was gone. The Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria 3 days ago, crushing the once proud Guangdong army like insects. The numbers did not lie. Japan could not win. We will follow His Majesty's will, Yumizu announced. All officers will maintain discipline. There will be no unauthorized actions. But his words fell on shattered hearts. Lieutenant General Takashi Mori, commander of the Imperial Guard, approached Anami. His voice dropped low. Minister. There are young officers who will not accept this. They speak of seizing the palace. Of destroying the recording before it reaches the nation. They believe they can change what has happened. Anami stared at the wall. On it hung a map of the Pacific. Red pins marked Japanese positions that had been retreating for 2 years. Guadalcanal. Saipan. Iwo Jima. Okinawa. Each pin represented a defeat. Each defeat represented tens of thousands of dead soldiers. What do they think they can change? Anami asked. The bombs will not unhappen. The dead will not rise. They think they can save Japan's honor. Anami turned. His eyes met Mori's. In them, there was something terrible, a grief so deep it had become stone. Honor, Anami repeated. I sent boys to crash their planes into ships. I told them their deaths would protect their mothers. Their sisters. I promised them their sacrifice would mean something. He paused. What honor do I have left to save? Mori had no answer. The afternoon passed in chaos. Officers gathered in small groups, whispering about coups and last stands. Some wept openly. Others sat alone, staring at nothing. The machinery of the Japanese military, the beast that had conquered half of Asia, was tearing itself apart from within. At sunset, Anime returned to his home. His wife met him at the door. She had heard the broadcast. Every Japanese citizen had. She did not ask questions. She simply bowed and led him to the dining room. They ate in silence. Rice. Fish. Pickled vegetables. The same meal they had shared for 20 years of marriage. When they finished, Anime's wife cleared the dishes without a word. Alone in his study, Anime looked at the photograph on his desk. His son. Killed in action 2 years ago. He had died believing Japan would win. He had died with honor. What would he say now? Anime opened his desk drawer. Inside lay his ceremonial tanto, a blade passed down through generations of warriors. He touched the handle. The metal was cold. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere in Tokyo, young officers were gathering weapons. Somewhere in the ruins, families were crying. Somewhere across the Pacific, American soldiers were preparing to occupy a nation that had sworn to fight to the last breath, and in his study, General Korechika Anime began to write his final letter. Major Kenji Hatanaka moved through the darkness like a blade seeking flesh. Behind him, 80 soldiers followed in silence, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. The imperial palace loomed ahead, its ancient walls black against the starless sky. Inside those walls lay the recording, the emperor's voice commanding surrender. If Hatanaka could destroy it before morning, the broadcast would never reach the people. Japan would fight on. It was 1 a.m. on August 15. The coup had begun. Hatanaka was 23 years old. He had never seen combat. He had spent the war behind a desk, planning operations he would never execute. But he burned with a fire that older men had lost. He believed, truly believed, that Japan's spirit could overcome any weapon. The atomic bombs were terrible, yes. But spirit could not be bombed. Honor could not be irradiated. If only the nation would fight, they would win. He reached the gate of the Imperial Guard Division. General Takashi Mori commanded here. Mori had refused to join the rebellion. He was a problem that needed solving. The confrontation was brief. Hatanaka and his co-conspirator, Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shiozaki, entered Mori's office with drawn swords. They demanded his support. Mori refused. He reminded them of their oath to the emperor. He told them the war was over. Shiozaki's blade opened Mori's throat before the general could finish his sentence. Blood splashed across the maps on the wall. Mori collapsed, his hands clutching air. Hatanaka watched without expression. The first general had fallen. There was no turning back now. While Hatanaka stormed the palace, other scenes unfolded across Tokyo. In his home, General Anime knelt on the tatami floor of his study. Before him lay rice paper, ink, and brush. He wrote slowly, carefully, as if each stroke carried the weight of empire. The letter was addressed to the nation. To his soldiers. To the dead. I apologize with my death for the great crime, he wrote. I believe in the eternal sacred spirit of Japan. His brother-in-law found him at 4 a.m. Anime had completed the ritual of seppuku, the horizontal cut across the abdomen. But he had refused the kaishikunin, the second who would end suffering with a beheading stroke. He wanted to die slowly. He wanted to feel every moment of atonement. Should I help you, brother? His relative asked, tears streaming. Anime shook his head. Blood pooled beneath him. His face was pale, but his eyes remained clear. Do not concern yourself, he whispered. I have served Japan. Now I will join my son. He died as dawn touched the sky. The war minister who had commanded millions fell silent in a room that smelled of ink and blood. At the palace, Hatanaka's rebellion crumbled. The conspirators searched frantically for the recording. They ransacked offices. They interrogated officials at sword point. But the disc containing the emperor's voice had been hidden too well. The chamberlains had anticipated betrayal. They had placed the recording in a pile of documents labeled Records of the Empress Household, a location no soldier would think to violate. By 5 a.m., the Eastern District Army had mobilized against the rebels. Regular troops surrounded the palace. Hatanaka realized his coup had failed. There would be no honorable last stand. There would be no glorious reversal. There would only be the morning broadcast, reaching every radio in Japan, ending the war forever. At 7:12 a.m., Major Kenji Hatanaka walked to the plaza in front of the imperial palace. He faced the rising sun. He drew his pistol, pressed it to his forehead, and fired. He was not alone in choosing death that night. Across Tokyo, across Japan, officers made their final decisions. Some chose the blade. Some chose the bullet. Field Marshal Hajime Sugiyama, former Army Chief of Staff, sat with his wife in their garden. They had decided together. They would not see American soldiers walk on sacred soil. They would not stand trial as war criminals. Sugiyama shot himself. His wife followed with a dagger. Lieutenant General Shigeru Honjo, advisor to the emperor, stabbed himself in the chest. Vice Admiral Mato Mugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, climbed into a dive bomber with 10 volunteers and flew toward Okinawa. They never arrived. Whether they crashed into the sea or were shot down, no one ever knew, but most generals did not die. General Yumizu sat in his office as dawn came. Reports arrived every hour. Rebellion crushed. Enemy dead. Sugiyama dead. The list of suicides grew. And still, Yumizu Saturday he thought of the soldiers in China. In Manchuria. In the scattered islands of the Pacific. 4 million men still bore arms under the rising sun. They would learn of the surrender soon. They would be told to lay down their weapons, something no Japanese soldier had ever been trained to do. Some would obey. Some would refuse. Some would die rather than submit. How many? Yumizu wondered. How many more deaths would this surrender bring? He removed his sword from his belt. The blade gleamed in the morning light. For a long moment, he stared at it. One stroke, and he could join enemy. One stroke, and his struggle would end. Instead, he placed the sword in his desk drawer. He closed the drawer. He locked it, then he called for his adjutant. There was work to be done. An army to demobilize. A nation to save from itself. Outside his window, the sun rose over a broken empire. The sun rose over Tokyo like an accusation. Smoke still curled from the firebombed districts, 300,000 dead in a single night of American incendiary raids 4 months ago, and the ruins had never stopped burning in General Yumizu's mind. Now he stood before 40 surviving officers in the war room where, just yesterday, they had heard their God Emperor command the impossible. There will be no more suicides, Yumizu announced. His voice carried no emotion. Emotion was a luxury he could not afford. Every man who kills himself is a man who cannot help rebuild Japan. Every officer who abandons his post abandons his soldiers. A young captain raised his hand. His name was Tanaka. He had fought on Guadalcanal, one of the few who escaped the island of death where 30,000 Japanese soldiers perished from combat, starvation, and disease. General, Tanaka said, how can we face our men? We promised them victory. We told them the emperor was divine. We sent their brothers to die on beaches and in caves. Now we must tell them it was all for nothing. Yumizu met his eyes. For a moment, the mask slipped. Behind it was a weariness so profound it seemed to age him a decade in seconds. Not for nothing, Yumizu replied. They fought for Japan. Japan still exists. That is not nothing. But his words rang hollow, even to himself. The orders went out that morning. Across the shattered empire, radio operators transmitted the instructions: cease all offensive operations, maintain defensive positions, await further commands. In China, 3 million Japanese soldiers lowered their weapons. In Manchuria, the retreating Guangdong army, once the pride of the imperial forces, surrendered to Soviet troops who had crushed them in 8 days of blitzkrieg. In the Pacific Islands, garrisons that had vowed to fight to the last man began the unthinkable process of capitulation. Not all obeyed. On Okinawa, Lieutenant Colonel E.I. Yamaguchi refused to believe the broadcast. He declared it American forgery and ordered his remaining troops to continue resistance. It took 2 weeks and a personal delegation from Tokyo to convince him the war was truly over. On remote islands, soldiers who had not heard the broadcast continued fighting for days. 4 weeks. Some would hide in jungles for decades, convinced Japan would never surrender, but most followed orders. They had been trained to obey. The same discipline that had sent them charging into machine guns now kept them still as enemy forces approached. In Tokyo, Colonel Masataka Ida wandered through the ruins like a ghost that he had screamed when the broadcast ended. He had called it lies. He had believed, really believed, that Japan could still win. Now Anami was dead. Hatanaka was dead. Sugiyama was dead. And Ida was alive, walking through streets where children scavenged for food in the rubble. He found himself at a Shinto shrine. The building had survived the bombings, a small miracle in a city of ash. An old priest sat on the steps, sweeping dust that would never stay away. "Soldier," the priest said without looking up. "You carry heavy burdens." Ida fell to his knees. The tears came before he could stop them, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He wept for the dead. For the emperor. For himself. For the young men he had encouraged to storm the palace, now buried in unmarked graves. The priest set down his broom and sat beside him. "In Buddhism," the old man said, "we teach that all things change. Victory changes to defeat. Defeat changes to wisdom. Grief changes to acceptance. Nothing is permanent, not even shame. How can I accept this?" Ida choked. "How can I accept what we have become?" The priest was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. "You accept it because you must. You accept it because the alternative is to stop living, and the dead cannot build a new world. Japan does not need more corpses. Japan needs men who will carry the weight of what happened and keep walking." Across the city, Yamizu was receiving the first American demands. The occupation terms were brutal but expected. Complete disarmament. Demobilization of all military forces. War crimes tribunals for senior leaders. American troops would land on Japanese soil within weeks. General Douglas MacArthur would rule Japan as Supreme Commander. One of Yamizu's aides slammed his fist on the table. "This is colonization. They will make us slaves." Yamizu shook his head. "They will make us live. After what we have done, that is more than we deserve." The aide stared. "General." "I have read the reports," Yamizu said quietly. "Nanking. The Burma Railway. The camps. Do you think the world does not know? Do you think they will forget?" He paused. "We are not the victims here. We are the ones who must answer for what Japan became." It was the first time he had admitted it aloud. The first time any of them had spoken the truth that haunted every senior officer. Japan had committed horrors. And now Japan would pay. That night, Yamizu returned to his quarters. He removed his uniform and folded it carefully. He looked at the medals on his chest, decorations for victories that had led to ultimate defeat. On his desk sat a single sheet of paper. Orders for the formal surrender ceremony. He would travel to Tokyo Bay. He would board an American warship. He would sign documents declaring Japan's complete and unconditional capitulation. He would sign his name to the end of everything he had ever known. Yamizu placed the orders in his pocket. Then he walked to the window and watched the stars emerge over his broken city. Somewhere out there, American ships were steaming toward Japan. The occupation was coming. The trials were coming. The judgment was coming, but so, perhaps, was something else. A future. Uncertain. Painful. But possible. The USS Missouri was the largest thing General Yoshijiro Yamizu had ever seen. 270 meters of American steel, bristling with guns that could have leveled Tokyo from 30 kilometers away. Around it, 400 Allied warships stretched across Tokyo Bay, battleships, carriers, cruisers, destroyers, a fleet so vast it turned the water gray with hulls. It was September 2, 1945. The day Japan would die, Yamizu stood in the small launch approaching the Missouri. Beside him sat Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, limping on his artificial leg, lost to a Korean independence bomber years ago. Behind them, the Japanese delegation wore borrowed morning coats and top hats, their military uniforms forbidden by the Americans. They looked like mourners at a funeral. Perhaps they were. As the launch drew closer, Yamizu counted the American sailors lining the Missouri's rails. Thousands of them. All staring down at the small boat carrying the representatives of their defeated enemy. Some faces showed triumph. Some showed hatred. Most showed nothing at all, the blank expressions of men who had killed Japanese soldiers on beaches from Guadalcanal to Okinawa and now watched their enemy come crawling to surrender. Yamizu thought of his own soldiers. 4 million men still under arms when the emperor spoke. 2 million more already dead. Thrown against these Americans in waves of human attacks that accomplished nothing except filling graves. He had read the intelligence reports. Japanese soldiers died at ratios of 10 to 1, 20 to 1, sometimes 50 to 1. They had courage. They had discipline. They had nothing that could stop American industrial might. The launch reached the Missouri's ladder. Yamizu climbed slowly, feeling every one of his 63 years. At the top, American officers waited in crisp uniforms, their medals gleaming. They did not salute. Why would they? The ceremony took place on the starboard deck. A simple table covered with green felt. 2 copies of the surrender documents, one in English, one in Japanese. General Douglas MacArthur stood at the center, microphone before him, broadcasting to the world. "We are gathered here," MacArthur declared, his voice carrying across the water, "to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored." Yamizu barely listened. He was watching the faces around him. American generals. British admirals. Chinese representatives. Australian commanders. Soviet officers. All the nations Japan had fought. All the nations Japan had lost to. Behind them, arranged in careful rows, stood the survivors. American prisoners of war, many still skeletal from years of captivity. Some wept openly. Some stared with eyes that would never fully heal from what they had witnessed in Japanese camps. Yamizu knew what had happened in those camps. Every senior officer knew. The starvation. The beatings. The medical experiments. The forced labor that killed thousands. Japan had signed the Geneva Convention. Japan had ignored it completely. Now Japan would answer. "I now invite the representatives of the Imperial Japanese government to sign the instrument of surrender," MacArthur announced. Shigemitsu went first. He limped to the table, adjusted his artificial leg, and signed with careful strokes. Then he stood and hobbled back, his face a mask of controlled humiliation. Yamizu's turn. He walked forward. Each step felt like wading through deep water. The silence was absolute, no wind, no waves, only the breathing of 2,000 witnesses. At the table, he picked up the pen. For one mad instant, he thought of refusing. Of throwing the pen into the sea and spitting in MacArthur's face. Of going out as Anami had, with blood and honor instead of ink and shame, but Anami was dead. And Japan still needed the living. Yamizu signed his name in swift, precise strokes. The ink dried on paper. The empire died on paper. Everything he had served, everything he had believed, everything millions had died for, ended with the scratch of a pen. He returned to his place. MacArthur spoke more words. Other signatures followed. American generals. Allied commanders. It all blurred together. Then it was over. The Japanese delegation filed back to their launch. No one spoke. Overhead, 400 American aircraft roared across the sky in perfect formation, a final demonstration of the power that had crushed Japan. As the launch pulled away from the Missouri, a young ensign turned to Yumizu. "General," he whispered, "what do we do now?" Yumizu watched the shoreline of Japan grow larger. Tokyo's ruins were visible even from the water, the firebombed districts, the collapsed buildings, the gray desolation of defeat, but between the ruins, he saw something else. Smoke rising from cook fires. Laundry hanging from makeshift lines. People moving through the streets. Living that he thought of his grandchildren. They would grow up in an occupied nation. They would learn new history from American textbooks. They would be taught that everything their grandfather fought for was wrong, and perhaps it was, but they would be alive. They would have a chance to build something different. The kamikaze pilots would never have children. The soldiers who starved on Pacific Islands would never grow old. The dead had paid the price of Japan's war, the living would pay a different price. Shame. Trials. Occupation. Decades of rebuilding, but they would live. What do we do now? Yumizu repeated the ensign's question. The launch reached the shore. Yumizu stepped onto Japanese soil, soil that was no longer truly Japanese, soil that would be ruled by foreigners for years to come. That he turned to the young man. Now we rebuild. Then General Yashijiro Yumizu walked forward into the ruins, leaving the Missouri behind him, carrying the weight of surrender toward whatever Japan would become. Behind him, in Tokyo Bay, the American fleet fired no salute. There was no honor for the defeated. Only silence, and the work that remained. The war was over, the reckoning had begun.